With that, we'll get started. Today, our speakers are Dr. Douglas Merkler and Shawn Freedberg. Douglas Merkler is a fourth-generation Nevadan and the resource soil scientist for Nevada with the USDA and RCS. He is currently involved with the Technical Soil Services Program for Nevada. Shawn Freedberg works as an account manager for Deep Root's Western U.S. projects. Deep Root develops solutions to enhance urban forests and surrounding watersheds in the city streets, parking lots, campuses, and other heavily paved areas. So with that, I will turn the time over to Doug Merkler.
Thank you, Rose, very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning, and I hope that there is a benefit that everyone gets out of this talk that we're going to do this morning. I truly am very passionate about the work that I do, and I love soils very much. And often people will tease me, and they'll call soil dirt just to see if they can kind of tease me and get under my skin a little bit. But it really brings up a bigger issue than that, and that is that soil has kind of this negative connotation. We talk about things being dirty, or we talk about something being soiled, and we need to wash it. And that's okay, but the difference is that when we're talking about a soil, say, versus dirt, what we're really talking about when we talk about soils, we're talking about a three-dimensional entity that's composed of horizons and layers and is incredibly biologically active. So this is a living thing. Dirt, on the other hand, is something you could probably put into the wheelbarrow or the back of a truck and haul it away. And those layers are all disrupted. The microbial ecological systems are all disrupted. So this is really, dirt is really soil that is out of place. So then, having said that, what is soil? Well, it's three phases of solid and gas and liquid comprises most of what is in the soil. Minerals and organic matter comprise most of the solids, and liquids are dominantly water and those things that are dissolved in water. Gases are pretty much air, but then it can be richer in some of the other constituents of the gases due to respiration within the soil. And these are characterized by horizons or layers that are definitely distinguishable from the original parent material that the soil is formed in. And this is due to translocations, due to transformations, additions, subtractions of material within the soil profile, and these form these layers. So this takes time. Usually the definition of these horizons or layers are more distinct over time. And the other criteria is this ability of soils to actually support life or support plants. So that's also kind of a key. At 30 feet of water, it's not really a soil. And bedrock, it's not really a soil. So the constituents are usually broken up. This is for a forest soil. So 2 to 5% organic matter is a pretty generous helping organic matter. That amount of organic matter in a soil would definitely make it very dark, black, very dark brown color. And even though it's only 2 to 5%, that amount is enormous. That's a lot. A lot of the desert soils in the southern part of Utah, over into Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, very, very lucky to get about 1/2 of 1% organic matter in those natural systems. And this is obviously then something we add a lot to in working in a built environment where we want to plant trees in urban environments. We're very conscious of the amount of organic matter that we add, and we should talk about the difference between that and compost a little bit later. But so about half of our soils, generally speaking, are comprised of the solid material, and the air and the water then occupy the pore space that remains. And so that's shared then by both the gas and the water. A completely saturated soil has no room left. It's all the pore space is occupied by water. And then as the soil dries, more and more airspace is available and the water is retained in the pores. Hans Jenny was a soil scientist or a pedologist at Cal Berkeley. And he developed and embellished a concept of formation factors of soils. The idea being almost as if we had a set of dials or rheostats that we could turn, and each of those dials represented one of the formation factors. So then if we were to turn the dials so they were identical, it wouldn't really matter where we were. We could be in central Idaho, or we could be in South Island, New Zealand. And if we had the climate and parent material and topography, the amount of time that a surface had been stable, and biotic factors that were very similar in both places, we would then expect that very similar soils would form. So this has been a really, really great tool for us in understanding processes having to do with soils and our ability to predict where those soils will occur. The climatic patterns obviously are temperature and rainfall, but an important point is not just the amount of rainfall that we might have, but also then the frequency of occurrence of when that rainfall actually happens, and when it happens in the landscape and its interaction with both the plants and the soil. So we can think of snowpack and spring melt, green up in the spring and then drying in the summer. Or we can think of monsoonal seasons, when we get that moisture then 35–50% of the annual moisture comes as rainfall due to convection storms during the summer when the plants are actively growing. And almost certainly then we'll get a distinction in those species that are adapted for those different conditions, and you'll get different plant assemblages growing at those conditions. This is just a typical climatogram for a more arid region. Only that it illustrates the point of definitely in the wintertime when you have more input of moisture into soil than is being withdrawn due to evapotranspiration, then we actually are recharging that soil, or we're putting money into the bank. We reach a point where then we begin to withdraw that moisture that we input into the soil, and that becomes a utilization of that moisture, and those are basically making withdrawals of that soil moisture from the soil, until we hit a point where essentially we've withdrawn all the water that the soil has, and we become somewhat moisture bankrupt in that soil. In an arid climate, we can see that happens at least in the southern Nevada, southern Utah area. Sometime in March, we're kind of out of water. If you take a look at the precipitation, the blue line along the bottom, you can see certainly there is precipitation that happens, a little bit of monsoonal moisture, say in the summertime, but that is woefully less than the evaporative demand, and so effectively is still dry all the way until we get back into around December, and we have a surplus once again. We begin to recharge the moisture within the soils. The parent materials that soils form from generally come from the lithic rock in the mountains. That material will have soils that can form in place on them, or that material can erode and be transported down the mountain front and be deposited out into fans and basins down below. And those typically occur in these sediment packages. So these packages are actually time differential. They're composed of different constituents, and generally speaking, we can almost think of it as if, well, they have a different constituency. So, like it might be tomato soup or chicken noodle soup, and those two things, well, they're not the same. And so, if we have a soil that forms in limestones, we would expect that there would be a lot of calcium carbonate that would be within those soils that form out of the limestone, and would be very much in contrast to, say, a soil that may be formed in granite or in gneiss or schist. So the beginning point of the origin of the geology, say, of the parent material, sets the course or the trajectory of the type of minerals that will weather and form within that soil. Regional geology within an area, even if you have been urbanized pretty heavily, this is an image from North Las Vegas, still gives you some insight into those soil differences that you may be able to find within an area. So even if you have golf courses and you have homes that have been developed, most certainly the soils have been disrupted, there's been leveling, there's been fill, and almost guaranteed along the surface you're not going to hit the same type of horizonation that you would in a native soil outside of that. But underneath, it certainly does imply properties of that material that probably are still intrinsically tied to that geographic area. So it's really good insight to be able to understand a little bit the geology of the area that you're working in, and how those properties of that material, say if it's gypsiferous or if it's very sandy materials, probably has carried through and is in part still part of the soil and the underlying material that you're dealing with. Elevation as part of topography, hugely important. And in the Intermountain West, well, what can I say? We're not Kansas. We have enormous gradients of elevation, and with those gradients in elevation, there is a relationship of moisture and rainfall. And as we go higher, we are generally wetter. We get more precipitation, more snowpack, more rainfall. And as we go higher, we're typically cooler. So those two factors are we're adding more water and we're reducing the amount of evaporative demand at the same time. So we have, this is an example of a cross-section across Southern California, across the Mojave Desert. And you can see that we go across Death Valley and in the hole down here in the bottom in the trough, we're 282 feet below sea level, just about 12,000 feet up on top of Mount Charleston, just to the west of Las Vegas Valley. And so this is a 12,000 foot difference in elevation, and we have enormous variation in the biomes that we go through. So whereas in the Midwest we have this huge latitudinal gradient that we deal with, out here in the West, in the Intermountain West, we can go through many of those biomes in a very short horizontal distance based on our elevation. This is kind of just an example of that. You can see that we're looking straight down or almost straight down on soils that were formed from Jurassic sandstones. And you can see that north face of the cliff in the shade, and you kind of intrinsically understand that that is cooler and it's shaded from solar insolation quite a bit. We see the flat surfaces on the fan surfaces down below. And so we can see that this shape and form of the land becomes rather important in the amount of solar energy that it receives. Now this would be the same if it was in a city, and in fact we were talking about buildings instead of rock outcrop and cliffs. They still provide this microenvironment of who gets sunlight and who does not get sunlight. So it turns out that this is a very major factor, and it can cause huge differences. Very short horizontal distances can get very big differences in microclimate. So this topography then is a real major factor in the distribution of solar insolation. Elevation, surface orientation, slope, and aspect, the shadows that are cast, all play a real important role and lead us to the conclusion that then even with the same amount of rainfall that we may get in a given area, depending upon the topography, we may in fact actually have a very different effective moisture that occurs on that landscape. And so we can begin to think about the water supplying capacity of the landscape itself, not just the soils, but the landscape itself, so that a north side of a mountain ridge is going to have a very different microclimate than a south side. Here's an example where we have ponderosa pine on the north aspect and scrub pine and pinyon pine mixed with curly leaf mountain mahogany on the south face. And you can see that then you're going to get a different amount of pine litter and organic matter input into these soils simply because of these different vegetative assemblages that are growing on them. And so even though this particular ridge and this peak most likely receives exactly the same amount of snow and rainfall, the effective moisture that occurs on both of these aspects then is very different. This slide is to illustrate time. All of us in the West have dealt with what is in the common nomenclature referred to as Caliche. As a soil scientist, I'm preferred to call it a petrocalcic or a durapan. But these are very old features, and these are definitely results of translocation and precipitation of soluble material at some depth in a profile, and then the coating of fragments and bridging between them, and finally plugging the whole system and forming an indurated cemented layer. This happens to be Mormon Mesa. This is just to the west of the city of Mesquite, Nevada, on the Nevada-Arizona border. And this is maybe one of the oldest geomorphic surfaces in North America, estimated to be about 5.2 million year old surface. This is, in fact, kind of the granddaddy then of this cemented petrocalcic horizons that we know of in North America. And generally speaking, as we run into this type of material in built environments where we want to plant trees or to plant assemblages within an urban environment, and we run into this type of cemented material, one of the options commonly used is to remove it. And this is going to be very expensive to do. This material has very high densities and is not quite as hard as rock, but is approaching it, getting to be that hard. It takes a lot of energy to remove it, manage it. So physical properties of soils. We've talked about the horizonation and the layers within the profile that occur. A little bit on texture, but this is also really important. There's been a tendency within landscape architecture to trend toward kind of coarser and coarser materials as a preferred type of material. But there's problems with that, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. The structure of soil and the PEDs, when we refer to a PED, we talk about that being the basic unit of structure within a soil is referred to as the PED. This leads to the actual formal name of the science of soil science, which is pedology. Soil strength and compaction. How dense is the material, and how resistant is it to shearing strength and erosional processes that happen to it, and then soil water and soil drainage. The trick with all of these properties is that they don't stand alone very well. They're all interrelated. So the texture then has a definite relationship to the density of the weight and volume relationship in the pore space within the soil. Organic matter that we may add to a soil also is going to affect the density of that and will modify the texture to a certain degree, and most certainly will have an effect on the nutrients that are there. The one common thread through all of this that gets back to this idea that soil is not just rotten rock, but that is very, very alive, is that all of these things are interwoven in this envelope of soil biology. So that's the microbes, the microfauna, the megafauna, the larger earthworms and larger critters that live in the soil. And ultimately, I guess we have to consider ourselves part of that biology, and there's an us component to this too in our effect that we have on these systems. So soils are produced solely by weathering of rock, and this is true. But even in these slides, in this concept of this geologic type of an idea of exposure to wind and rain, rock slowly breaks down, and it could be centuries to produce the breakdown of the minerals from the rocks that occur within the soil. This slide's kind of an important idea in that there's different processes going on within soils that operate at different time scales. And so the longest is this. This is back to this geologic concept of soils being rotten rock, is the time it takes for the minerals to weather, to break apart and form other minerals that occur in the soil. But carbon is maybe the next step down, and now we're talking scales from hundreds of years to tens of years, that carbon is definitely there. Carbon sequestration within soils is the largest source of sequestered carbon on our planet. But it's temporally there, maybe centuries at best. And the last one, just as an example, maybe is water. And water can be there for just a few minutes, to days, to weeks, maybe months. In its transient occupation of soil space. We have all of these things that are interrelated and working together, and yet they're operating at very different timescales. Just an example of a couple of profiles. On the left is actually a back swamp floodplain position, down to the marks on the tape are in centimeters. And you can see down to about 20 to 30 centimeters is a silt cap that is sitting on top of fine sands in a deposit on a floodplain. This definitely shows that water floods on top and deposits silts as a cap. And those silts are a much slower infiltration of water through them. And we can verify that this is a top-down or a flooded system by, if you look kind of around 80 to 60 centimeters along the tape, you'll see little dendritic threads of orange, which are iron oxide modeling, that occur along root channels. The only way that we can get this is if the water is coming from the top down and it's flowing through the macropores and reducing the environment adjacent to the roots, and we're getting these models along the root channels that absolutely show that this is a top-down system. On the right-hand side, even though the tapes show approximately the same depths from photo to photo, these are in inches, we can see that down to about 16 inches, an amazing amount of organic carbon. This is actually in the floodplain in Las Vegas Wash, and this is a remnant of a cattail marsh that used to be there prior to the erosion and incision in the floodplain. This was fed from effluent into the wash and supported 16-foot typha, 10-foot typha cattail marshes that were out there prior to the incision and the drainage of that. So we have an enormous amount of carbon input into the soil in the upper part, and down below, not the very distinct modeling within the root channels, but here the models were very diffused and smudged throughout, definitely an indication of groundwater coming from the bottom up, not from the top down. And so we kind of have this idea of looking at a description of a soil and understanding how all these things work. But it's very, very important that whether we're talking about natural systems in a landscape, or we're talking about putting together a system of cells within an urban environment that we're doing, each of those can be considered kind of a pet-on or a unit that we look at. And yet the soil itself is really a collection of many of those all together in what we refer to as kind of a polypedon. Let me see if we can get it. So there's a collection of all of these together, and they form a polypedon. And then generally in natural systems, those polypedons are related to a position within a landscape. And this is then a very helpful process we use in being able to map soils, is this collection of polypedons. Each of these individual are a little different than their neighbors, a little bit different than the ones that are adjacent to them. But they're similar enough that the properties that they have and the interpretations that we would derive from those properties are the same. And consequently, then we can interpret all of those together as a single soil. Here's an example of some things happening very close together in Phoenix, Arizona. A disturbed soil or a subsoil that was very compacted and very dry in the upper 18 inches, and you can see that there's just where the shrubs have some irrigation, they've done pretty well. But in the inner space, there's almost nothing. Almost across the street from this very same place is an area that's undisturbed and hasn't been compacted. And the entire profile was friable and moist. And you can see the grasses now are growing, and the inner space is completely covered in vegetation. So there's this enormous contrast in very similar material just within a stone's throw of each other. So in the texture, I guess, really briefly what I want to do is to talk to you about the sand, silts, and clay, and the sands being larger particles that provide an integrity and a structure for the soil. It's the spaces between these sand grains these pores that form really the matrix for the rest of the soil. Silt happen to be the perfect size due to capillarity. When the silt particles are adjacent to each other, the inner spaces between them are just the right size to hold on to water. They hold water at a tension that's appropriate for plants to be able to remove it. And then we get to the clay, and the clays are so small that they hold water also, but now they hold it under a tension that sometimes is higher than the plants can actually extract the water. So you can literally have clays that will feel somewhat moist, and yet to the plant, they're actually somewhat dry. In addition, clays are a mineral fraction of clays. We talk about clay minerals, and they have a negative charge to them and thus are chemically active. And it's the clay fraction that really then is our fertility in soils and our ability to hold these cations of calcium and magnesium and nutrients that the plants need are being held in the clay fraction of the soil. A lot of times when you get tests that are run in a laboratory and you'll run a test, you'll get a sand and a silt and a clay. It's important to understand then that the sands have very different size fractions that are looked at, and most tests don't do that. They're going to just give you what the sand is. But it's a very good idea, if possible, and if you can ask for the test, to have them actually do the sand fractionation for you, because very fine sands begin to really act like silts, and very coarse sands begin to almost start acting like rock fragments in class within the soil. And so then the very last thing let's talk about on this slide is the gravel, cobble, stones, and boulders. And they don't hold any water at all. They're not involved in any of the fertility at all. What they do is they pretty much dilute the volume of the finer materials that do all of those things. So the rock fragments within the profiles are absolutely a dilution of the volume of the soil that we want. So if you have 80% rock fragments, that you've only got 20% soil. It really is available to you. A sandy loam topsoil, kind of an image of how that looks. You can almost literally see the coarser sand grains within this material as you look at it. And when we plot this in a corner, it's also important to know that if you call something a sandy loam or a sandy clay loam, it doesn't always mean that you have the sandy clay loam has a negative connotation in the texture that material may be. Is that actually understanding the percentages of the sand, silt, and clay and understanding where they plot out on this triangle is very important. Because you can see here that the loam and the sandy loam and the sandy clay loam, well, they're not all that different. If you plot over into this corner and you're just below the 20% of clay line, that you're going to get something that maybe that they tend to act very similar, even though one might be called a sandy loam and one a loam. So structure is also very important, as we see here, and I'm going to go to the next slide in the vein of being quick. Here we can see this structure in this particular soil are actually bubbles that do not connect with each other, and this impedes water movement. Water will not move through a vesicular crust like this until it's actually saturated. Here's just a diagram from soil physicist Phil L. that kind of illustrates that these surface crusts chronically provide problems for infiltration in soils. This is a slide showing the density. We talked about concrete being 2.3 and the calcrete and the caliche being hard. Caliche runs from about 2 to 2.2 in its density, and it's just almost as hard as concrete. Forest soils are light, less than a gram per cubic centimeter, and thus are very friable and beneficial. Water infiltration into a finer material being discharged into a coarser material then is inhibited. So you can kind of see where that would happen. It's intuitive, I think, that the reverse of this is where you have a coarse material, the water races through it, hits the finer material, and somewhat perches underneath. But it's not always obvious to everyone that the finer material on top going into a coarse material will have the same effect. Available water based on our clay. We talked about clays actually holding on to water tightly. This is illustrated in this graph. And so we have this idea of water that is present in the soil and the pores, that is, gravity will drain the water off, and the water that's left is called field capacity, to the water that's being held tight enough that the roots of the plants cannot withdraw them, and that's a wilt point. And so the different textures then have a huge amount of difference in the amount of water that's available to them. We usually measure water as volumetric. Most of the sensors that you buy, that you use, are volumetric. But we have to translate those into attention so that we understand how the water is being held from the context and perspective of a plant root. A lot of this information is available today very, very simply for everyone. This is just an example of an online soil survey browser. Soil Web. This is going to be available, the talk, and that location there. This will fit onto anybody's cell phone. Use the GPS on your phone to locate where you are, and then come back and tell you what the soil is that you're standing on. So you can gain a lot of information in a mobile sense by having some of these newer apps that are just right on your phone. And with that, I'm going to conclude this. I'll let you guys read this. And if you guys have a couple of questions and I have any time left for those, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, great. Well, Doug, thank you. That was great. And hopefully that'll be a perfect segue into some of the things that I'd like to share with the group about some recent projects in Utah. Thank you, Rose and Meredith, for having me. So my name is Shawn Freedberg, and I work at Deeproot. Deeproot is a manufacturer of products that are primarily focused on the urban forest industry. We make root barriers, water barriers, arbor ties, and a product called the Silva Cell. The Silva Cell is what I'm going to focus on today, and I'll focus on 2 installations in Utah. So just make sure I can. Great. The two projects that I'm going to mention, one is at Temple Square in Salt Lake City, and the other is a private project at the New Skin headquarters building in Provo. So before I go into the actual products and the case studies, some of you may be familiar with the Silva Cell, but assuming that not everybody is familiar with the product, I want to give a little bit of an overview of what we are trying to achieve with the product, and then I'll show you how it's been used to provide soil volumes for growing trees in urban areas. So our mission at Deeproot is see if I can get it here. Great. To restore the ecosystem services to the built environment by integrating trees, soil, and stormwater. We have several partners that we've worked with to kind of build our knowledge and to contribute to the growing kind of an ever-changing wealth of information that we need to constantly be aware of to make sure that our products are meeting the needs of science as it advances. So Kestrel Design Group are experts in stormwater management and integrating that into the environment. James Urban is a landscape architect and a noted urban tree and soil person, an expert. I think many of Doug's slides referenced that they were from James's work. And then we work with several engineers and with some folks in the tree and nursery industry. And this is the basic concept of what we're trying to figure out. We understood from our experience in the urban forest business with the root barriers and the water barriers that many trees across the country, well, in fact, across the world, being planted in urban environments are not surviving. And we saw a very clear path to what we understood to be the major problem, and that was a lack of available soil volume. So in this sketch, you can see what we understand to be the problem, that we have a pavement that is oftentimes very close, within 2 feet of the root ball of an urban tree, and that pavement requires a very compacted subbase underneath of it to make it stable, and that very compacted subbase, here I refer to uncompacted soil. I don't know if Doug would even call what goes underneath pavement soil, but it is not a very hospitable environment for supporting healthy root growth. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do you get uncompacted soil into that environment? So our solution comes out of that sketch that you just saw there. And what we have done is built a system to hold up the sidewalk while providing a volume for uncompacted loam soil underneath the pavement. So the Silva Cell, as it says here, is that modular building block for containing that soil, and it's while supporting traffic loads and accommodating surrounding utilities. And this is what the product looks like in sketch. It is kind of a base element and then a deck that goes over it. It's approximately 4 feet long by 2 feet wide by about 16 inches deep. And it can be stacked up to 3 tall. Now what I'm going to show you now are a bunch of installation images, and it's just important to kind of have this understanding of this unit that we work with to put the adequate soil into the environment where it's not presently found. Each of these cells holds 10 cubic feet of soil. So as you can see, moving across the page from left to right, if you have just a single cell, you would add 10 cubic feet of loam soil to your project. And all the way to the right, and stacked up 3 high, you have a total of 30 cubic feet. And then those can be placed around your planting area to fill that space up to the required soil volume that would be required for your particular planting. So just to give you a little sense of what it actually looks like when it's not just a sketch and it's not just a picture in an office, but actually when it's going in the ground. This is the product being installed in Tacoma, Washington area. But it's a good overview to show kind of how the product stacks up and then how you're able to backfill into that system with a loam soil. So taking what we were just looking at and imagining what happens once the tree is planted and is introduced to that loam soil, this is what we call a cutaway section rendering, looking from the street back toward the sidewalk and the building beyond. What we typically see in most projects is a urban environment where you have maximum is usually a 5 by 5 tree opening, and assuming that gives you 25 square feet. In the best case scenario, they go down approximately 3 feet and they add the root ball on top of a compacted base so that it doesn't settle, and then put a little bit of planting soil around it, and that usually provides an entire volume, including the root ball, of 75 cubic feet of soil. What we are trying to do is to utilize the space underneath the sidewalk to give that tree even more soil, up to what Jim Urban thinks is kind of the goal of 1,000 to 1,200 cubic feet per tree. And you can see that's illustrated in the adjacent red line that outlines one Silva cell. And here you see the additional Silva cells. So they're stacked on top of each other. They're 3 high in this case, and as deep as the sidewalk will allow them to be. Ultimately, our goal is to deliver an additional 900 cubic feet of soil, so that in total there's approximately 1,000. This is just an image of what we often come into contact with in terms of the landscape architecture and the city wanting kind of a very urban environment with very large trees without much opening for those trees. And I show this project because we not only have the image, but then we have the kind of initial planting, and then we have the project 4 years later. And what's important to note is that underneath all of this paving is what I'm going to show you in the next slide, an entire field, if you will, of soil. So all of those trees are sharing this soil that's being held in these Silva cells. So now let me quickly move on to a couple of projects in Utah that are utilizing this technology. So the first is Temple Square in Salt Lake City. I took this image off the web. I'm fairly certain that it's the exact same site, just pre-construction. You'll see the street trees there on the left, and then the large wall. If you kind of keep your mind on that relationship, you'll see what's happened moving forward. So this is that same site. You'll notice that the wall is there, but the construction has removed all of the street trees. It appears they're putting in a new utility corridor, and the sidewalk is gone. What they chose to do in that area was to replant the street trees and to provide them with as much soil as possible. So what you're seeing here in this slide is the Silva cells are being set up in the area that is typically under the sidewalk. So here you can see where I'm pointing to on the left is the finished grade. That will be sidewalk and open planting and grass area along the curb. And you see the dash line separating the sidewalk from that planting strip, if you will. Here's another image. Once all the cells are set up, you can clearly start to see that the trees will have that planting strip along with the curb, and that was all they had in the past, and now they will have access to that entire volume adjacent to it, to the right between the wall of the church, Temple Square, and the planting strip. Here you're seeing as those soil cells, the Silva cell is starting to be filled in with the soil, and they're kind of just moving down the block. And then ultimately here is, just after the sidewalk has been poured over the top of the Silva cells and the trees have been installed, and hopefully we'll have some more pictures soon to update you. This is a few years ago, and it would be great to get an update on these. The next project I'm going to show you is just a different application, and it's in Provo at the New Skin headquarter building. This is an application that is often an area where our product can be well utilized, and that's when we have a situation where there is no available soil other than what's brought to the site. So this is what we would call an on-structure situation where there's either a basement or a parking garage or something below that will not allow the trees to be planted in any significant depth of soil. So what they're doing here is utilizing a kind of long corridor that I believe is eventually underneath some stairs to fill with soil and allow the trees to grow into that area. This is a sketch that was sent to us to kind of outline what that would look like. So you see, moving from the top of the sheet down, what the finished product will look like is it will essentially appear that you're standing on or looking at a sea of granite pavers, but those pavers are over a 2-inch setting bed, which is over 8 inches of concrete, and underneath that you have, an kind of unlimited volume of soil that's being supported by the Silva cells, and then that is over a kind of waterproofing and protection slab which sits on top of the concrete roof. And here are some more images of the Silva cells going in. You see kind of off in the distance and a gap in the Silva cells. That is a typical where you would plant a tree and then let the roots move into the volume being created by the Silva cells. Here's another detail. Not sure that Doug would think this is the best soil for planting in this environment, and I'm not sure exactly how we came up with the soil spec for this particular project, but the point here is that the Silva cells can be filled with any specified soil, and that can be done project by project. Again, this is the void left open in the Silva cells for the tree planting area. Here again, you see a little bit more close-up detail of it. And then I'm sure we're getting close to running out of time, so I just want to bring up one other critical point, which is that this cell, while not only holding 10 cubic feet of soil, also treats on average 2 cubic feet of stormwater. So most of our projects that we work on now are addressing the urban condition of stormwater runoff and routing much of that stormwater into the Silva cells and allowing it to fill into the voids that Doug mentioned, and to provide the benefit of slowing down that water, removing a lot of the pollutants from that water, and providing some of the critical necessary ingredients in terms of soil moisture for the tree root health. So I think I'll stop there and leave time for questions or comments or both for Doug or myself.
Very good. Thank you so much, Shawn. Great presentation. We do have quite a few questions, especially about Silva Cell, so I'll ask a few of the questions that are directed towards Shawn, and then I'll ask a couple questions that are directed towards Doug. So we have a question. This is from Teresa. She asks, how resistant is the Silva Cell product to heaving when the environment has a deep permafrost layer or an extremely cold climate?
Oh, wow. Teresa, that's a great question. And my immediate answer is that I don't have a specific answer for you on that, but I could follow up and get that for you. I work primarily on the western U.S., and we have this product throughout Canada and the Northeast and the Southeast and in the UK. And I know that we deal with that, but I haven't myself come across that issue very often. And so I don't have a direct answer for you, but I know that we are installed in several climates where there is deep freezes. The one thing that I can say, just my initial reaction, is that the soil is not compacted in the Silva Cell. There's about 93% void in there, so there's a lot of room for movement before the actual cell itself would tend to move. So I hope that answers it, and I can follow up with Rose and Meredith with a answer to that specifically.
Thanks, Shawn. Here's another question. This is from Angel Lopez. Wouldn't large root systems over time destroy the structure of the system?
Angel, that's a great question, and we get that a lot. And the science that we understand behind this is one that suggests over a very large time period that the amount of voids that are in this cell would allow the roots to move through that void space without needing to challenge or work against the structure of the cell. But our product has been in the ground for approximately 7 years, and we don't have a great detailed picture of what that root system looks like, post 30 years. But that's the intention, is that those large roots that would be in the root zone immediately around the trunk would have the volume of the Silva cell to fill in before it would challenge the structure of the cell.
Thanks again for a good answer. Brad Hayes wonders if there's a special type of concrete that allows water and air penetration.
Oh yeah, great question. In fact,
the Silva cell grid.
I think the next, I don't know, can I still move the slide?
Go forward.
Any type of permeable paver or permeable concrete is a great resource for introducing water and air into that system. Again, remember, the soil that gets put into the Silva cells is an uncompacted soil. We often leave approximately 1 to 3 inches gap at the top of the Silva cell for that exchange that you're talking about. And we anticipate that the soil, the organic matter in that soil will decompose over time, and so there's kind of an active exchange of air and root mass throughout that system as the roots are growing and filling in and dying off in the cells.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Meredith asks, is the soil health self-sufficient, or will there need to be amendments?
That is something that we are researching quite heavily, and our research is very clear that as long as there is root growth and root volume kind of doing what it does and exchanging and moving the soil, that soil will continue to be alive and active and healthy. And we have a blog at deeproot.com. You can go and sign up for our blog and read old blog posts, and there's a blog post specifically related to that issue.